Imagine a grand auditorium somewhere in Africa. The lights are dim. Delegates shift in their seats. On stage, an elderly statesman steps up to the microphone not to celebrate, but to confront. His voice is steady, his words explosive. Democracy, as we've known it for centuries, is being rejected even in its birthplace. That man is Raila Odinga, former Prime Minister of Kenya. A man who, after decades of defending Western-style democracy, just did the unthinkable. He called it a rigged system, a colonial holdover, a lie. This wasn't said in a private meeting or whispered in frustration. It was declared before Africa and perhaps before the world. And it echoes the defiant stance of another African leader who's been making waves, Burkina Faso's Ibrahim Traoré, the young captain who dares to ask, "What if democracy is not enough?" Odinga's words have ignited a wildfire of conversation across the continent, especially among the youth. He questioned why African leaders must fly to Washington to sign peace deals, why African resources are auctioned off in London without a single African in the room, and why decades after independence Africa still waits for permission to rise. The era of timid silence, he said, is over. And maybe he's right. But here's the question, do African nations still need Western models to govern, or is it time to create their own, rooted in tradition, dignity, and self-determination? If you've ever asked whether democracy should serve Africa or the other way around, this message is for you. Please like, share, and subscribe if you believe the truth is more powerful than the systems trying to silence it. In a world of scripted speeches, polished press releases, and diplomatic smiles, it's rare for a politician to stand up and speak from the gut. But Raila Odinga, former Prime Minister of Kenya, did just that, and he did it with fire in his eyes. It would have been easier for him to say nothing. After all, he had just lost the race for African Union chair. He could have bowed out gracefully, delivering a safe, forgettable speech. Instead, he shook the room. Democracy, as we've known it for centuries, he said, is being rejected, even in its cradle. He wasn't talking to Europe or America. He was speaking to Africa and to every young African who's ever asked, why hasn't democracy delivered? Odinga did not mince words. He called Western-style democracy a scam, a system designed not to liberate Africa, but to keep it obedient within the limits of global financial and political control. We vote every 5 years, he said, but in between those votes, our resources are bargained away, our dignity is compromised, and our future is mortgaged without our consent. He singled out the growing number of security for minerals deals, secretive agreements between African governments and foreign powers, where rare earths, gold, oil, and bauxite are handed over in exchange for military aid or surveillance technology. To Odinga, that is not sovereignty. That is surrender dressed in diplomatic language. One of the most powerful moments in his speech came when Odinga recalled a closed-door meeting in London between US and Chinese officials to discuss the global price of rare minerals. These minerals, he reminded the audience, are largely extracted from African soil. Not a single African was present, he said. Yet we are the ones whose land is being stripped. We are the ones who will pay the price. That sentence echoed like thunder. It was no longer about democracy as theory. It was about power ownership and the right to be heard. Midway through his address, Odinga asked a question that sent shivers through the room. Are we practicing democracy to free ourselves or just to be seen as well-behaved by our former colonizers? He wasn't asking for a new dictatorship. He was demanding a new kind of democracy, one that begins with dignity, listens to its citizens, and isn't dictated by institutions thousands of miles away. Odinga clarified, democracy isn't the enemy, but a borrowed, unfit version of it, one that ignores Africa's unique history and traditions, is dangerous. What Africa needs, he argued, is a model built from within, rooted in culture, values, and accountability. This wasn't just a speech by an aging politician. It was a wake-up call to an entire generation. Odinga pointed to a staggering fact: over 70% of Africans are under the age of 35. Many of them no longer believe in political systems that keep them poor, silent, and marginalized. We must ask, he said, for whom is this democracy really working? If the answer isn't our youth, then it has failed. He lamented the painful reality that so many young Africans risk their lives crossing the Mediterranean in search of better futures, not because they want to leave home, but because home has let them down. That, to Odinga, is the greatest failure of all. As he closed the first part of his speech, Odinga's voice did not falter. Instead, it rose. We cannot wait for someone else's version of democracy to save us. That savior is not coming. We must build our own here on our own soil with our own hands. Those weren't just words. They were a torch passed from one generation to the next. And for the first time in a long time, the room was not filled with polite applause, but with something far rarer silence. The kind that comes when everyone realizes the truth has just been spoken. Raila Odinga's speech did more than stir a room. It lit a match in a continent already filled with dry tinder. It wasn't just what he said, it was when and how he said it. Just weeks after Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso openly rejected Western military partnerships and dissolved the Electoral Commission in his country, Odinga's voice echoed like a second drumbeat in a growing continental rhythm, one of disobedience, courage, and redefinition. For years, Odinga had been viewed as part of the establishment, a reformer, yes, but still working within the democratic framework laid out by the West. That made his transformation all the more electrifying. If even Raila is questioning democracy, one Kenyan journalist tweeted, then something big is shifting in Africa. And it is. Across West Africa, particularly in the alliance of Sahel states Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, Odinga's remarks landed like thunder. Social media pages tied to Pan-African youth movements posted clips of his speech side by side with Ibrahim Traoré's fiery declarations. The captions read, "This is no longer about politicians. This is about reclaiming Africa." Traoré, a 36-year-old soldier turned president, had already ignited hope among Africa's youth by refusing IMF loans, expelling French troops, and prioritizing internal development over elections. Odinga, a man 4 decades older, had now joined the same philosophical rebellion from the opposite side of the generational spectrum. It was a powerful message: the young and the old are converging. In South Africa, a prominent labor union leader said Odinga has pulled the curtain. "We've been applauding a model that has never truly served us." In Senegal, students gathered at the university gates and began holding what they called democracy dialogues, quoting Odinga's line, "Voting alone is not freedom." In Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traoré himself, though he made no official statement, reshared a segment of Odinga's speech through a government-backed youth channel, a symbolic gesture that didn't go unnoticed. In Nigeria, reactions were more divided. Pro-democracy advocates cautioned that rejecting Western models shouldn't mean embracing authoritarianism. A respected political science professor at the University of Ibadan said, "Yes, we must question foreign blueprints, but let us not mistake rage for reform. What we build must still be accountable." But even critics admitted Odinga's words had struck a nerve. International media outlets scrambled to respond. Al Jazeera called it the speech of a generation. BBC Africa aired selected clips, carefully omitting the harshest critiques of the IMF and US influence. CNN International remained silent for 3 days before issuing a short piece describing Odinga's tone as controversial and unexpected. But what many African observers noticed wasn't the coverage, it was the discomfort. They don't know what to say when the elders speak like the youth, a Ghanaian journalist commented. And indeed, Odinga's speech was not easy to dismiss. It was eloquent, data-driven, and filled with history. He quoted Chinua Achebe, Julius Nyerere, even President Woodrow Wilson, reminding the world that democracy was once an ideal, not a geopolitical tool. "We want democracy," he said, "but one that listens, one that belongs to us, not one handed down to us like a second-hand suit." Toward the end of his speech, Odinga's tone shifted from reflective to urgent. He reminded the audience of a painful truth. Youth are not waiting. They are drowning in the Mediterranean. They are risking everything. Why? Because we have let them down. And then he issued what felt less like a conclusion and more like a final plea. Africa must act in unison. If we do not hang together, we shall hang separately. Those were the words that trended across African Twitter, Facebook, and WhatsApp for days. Memes were created. Hashtags exploded. Nana hang together, Nak Odinga unchained, Naksh democracy, reimagined. The reaction wasn't merely emotional, it was strategic. From Nairobi to Niamey, civic groups began organizing town halls. Radio hosts invited elders and youth to debate the future of African governance. Even political rivals across party lines acknowledged that a fundamental conversation had begun and it couldn't be ignored. In many ways, this was the climax not just of a speech, but of a long brewing movement. A quiet, patient anger among ordinary Africans who feel spoken down to by foreign donors, underrepresented in trade deals, and unseen in democratic theater. Raila Odinga may not hold office. But with this speech, he held something far more powerful, the attention of a continent and perhaps the start of something irreversible. A speech, no matter how fiery, only matters if it stirs action. And in the weeks following Raila Odinga's address, the civil and political aftershocks rippled far beyond the stage. Because while much of the Western media shrugged or dismissed his words, ordinary Africans, especially teachers, traders, students, and village elders, began echoing the same concerns. Not just about democracy, but about the direction of the continent itself. And for many, it boiled down to one painful truth: we are tired of waiting. In towns and cities across Africa, the reaction was not one of riots or slogans. Instead, it came in the form of conversations, organizing, and refusal to continue as usual. In Burkina Faso, where Traoré's reforms were already taking root, civil servants began holding weekly forums with citizens to discuss local needs without donor supervision, without outside consultants. In Kenya, teachers' unions and retired civil servants called for a review of foreign-backed educational policies, questioning why curriculums are written to serve World Bank indicators rather than community realities. In Ghana and Senegal, student organizations began producing pamphlets on homegrown democracy, inspired by Odinga's speech. They quoted his warning that Africa cannot keep exporting raw materials and importing its ideas. This was no longer about ideology. It was about dignity. Within the halls of government across the continent, Odinga's speech did something rare: it divided the elite. In Kenya, the ruling party offered a cautious response, calling Odinga's remarks thought-provoking but too radical. Yet within days, several sitting MPs echoed his calls for African Union reform, saying, "We may disagree with his tone, but not his questions." In Nigeria, some leaders within the opposition seized the moment to call for a continental convention, a pan-African assembly, not to rewrite laws, but to rethink them. How do we build systems that combine traditional consensus with modern accountability? How do we decentralize power while uniting trade, travel, and diplomacy? These were the questions that Odinga had reignited. Meanwhile, in South Africa, members of parliament from minority parties introduced a bill proposing visa-free travel across the continent for African citizens, citing the European Union model Odinga had mentioned. The bill didn't pass, but the debate alone marked a shift. It was no longer taboo to ask, why does it take longer to fly from Nairobi to Dakar than from Paris to Berlin? Why must Africans apply for visas to visit each other's countries when Americans and Europeans can move freely across theirs? One of the sharpest consequences of Odinga's message fell on economic policy circles, especially regarding Africa's relationship with foreign investment and trade structures. Many citizens began questioning the logic behind long-standing aid agreements. Why, they asked, do we continue to borrow loans when we sit atop gold, lithium, uranium, bauxite, cobalt, oil? Odinga had warned that many of these deals are mineral first, peace second, referencing the Human Rights Watch critique of recent African mining agreements. In Uganda, journalists began investigating recent security for extraction pacts. In Mozambique, villagers protested the relocation of entire communities for foreign mining operations, demanding consultation and environmental guarantees. Their banners bore a new phrase: "Not without our voice." This was not nationalism in the old exclusionary sense. This was something deeper, a moral and generational reawakening. Odinga had also spoken of Africa's traditional systems of conflict resolution, where disagreements were not litigated in courts but resolved under trees through dialogue and respect. In Mali, a council of elders launched a Palava Circle initiative, a community-based platform that brings together youth leaders and opposition groups to resolve disputes before they erupt. Similar models are now being piloted in Niger, Togo, and parts of rural Ethiopia. This return to ancestral governance, blended with modern civic tools like mobile voting and AI-enabled town halls, is becoming the heart of the new African experiment. And it all traces back to a question Odinga posed: can we redesign democracy to reflect who we are, not who we're told to be? Skeptics still abound. Some governments worry that Odinga's speech might embolden military takeovers or anti-constitutional movements. Others see it as a passing storm, a media moment. But the civil and political consequences are clear. Ordinary citizens are asking harder questions. Political elites are being forced to choose sides. Institutions once seen as untouchable, like the African Union or IMF partnerships, are now open to public scrutiny. Whether this becomes a full tectonic shift or simply a tremor depends on what happens next. But for the first time in decades, Africa is not waiting for permission to think aloud. It is speaking, and the world is starting to listen. If Raila Odinga's speech had been given 20 years ago, it might have been quietly dismissed by Western diplomats as populist rhetoric. But in today's geopolitical climate, where China, Russia, and Pan-African alliances are redrawing the global map, his words rang louder than anyone expected. And the West was watching. In Washington, the immediate response was muted. No official statement came from the State Department. However, behind closed doors, think tanks and policy analysts began publishing quiet memos asking the same question: what if democracy as we've promoted it is no longer trusted, not even by its champions? Raila Odinga had long been considered a trusted voice in Western development circles. He had met with U.S. presidents, collaborated with institutions like the World Bank and USAID. So, his public disavowal of imported democracy created what one insider at the Council on Foreign Relations called a credibility crisis. An article in Foreign Policy magazine summarized it this way: if African leaders begin to reject democracy not as flawed, but as foreign, the entire moral foundation of U.S. Africa policy collapses. In private briefings, U.S. policymakers expressed concern that Odinga's speech could fuel the ideological momentum behind leaders like Ibrahim Traoré, who have already distanced themselves from Western security arrangements and financial institutions. Across Europe, the response was inconsistent. France, still reeling from its military withdrawal from Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, chose not to respond at all. But editorial pages in Paris warned that if figures like Odinga continue to align rhetorically with leaders like Traoré, Europe may be losing Africa not to China, but to Africa itself. In Germany and the Netherlands, more progressive voices acknowledged the legitimacy of African disillusionment. A piece in Der Spiegel noted, when democracy becomes a costume and not a conviction, it loses its power, and Odinga merely said aloud what many African citizens already feel. In contrast to Western confusion, countries in the global South, particularly Brazil, India, and South Africa, viewed Odinga's remarks as a potential inflection point. In India, a senior foreign affairs columnist celebrated the speech as a Pan-African awakening. In Brazil, political commentators drew parallels to Latin America's own struggles with imposed economic models. Even China, without naming Odinga, directly praised the growing independence of African voices during a press briefing in Beijing. The underlying message was clear: Africa is becoming a contested space once again, but this time the battle is not over territory, it is over ideas. For the United States, the challenge now is not simply competing for trade or military influence, it is competing for trust. Odinga's speech was not just a critique of policy, it was a critique of presumption, the belief that Africa should follow paths carved elsewhere. If the U.S. wishes to remain relevant in Africa's future, it may need to listen more and direct less, to partner rather than prescribe. As one retired U.S. ambassador quietly noted, when the elders speak, the wise listen. It's time we remember that. When an elder speaks, it is not always to shout. Sometimes it is to remind us of what we've forgotten. Raila Odinga did not call for war. He didn't tear up any constitution. But with calm clarity and unwavering honesty, he said what many feared to admit: Africa has waited long enough. We must now walk in our own shoes, even if the road is unpaved. His words were not just a critique of democracy. They were a call to redesign it, to reclaim it, to root it in soil where tradition meets technology, where voices long silenced are finally heard. But history warns us, when new ideas rise, old systems push back. Already murmurs of destabilization, propaganda, and isolation are beginning to circle. Africa's awakening will not be welcomed by everyone, especially those who've benefited from its sleep. And yet, this is not a moment for fear. It is a moment for clarity. Because what Odinga said, and what leaders like Ibrahim Traoré are proving, is that sovereignty is not a slogan. It is a structure, built in schools, trade routes, constitutions, and communities that dare to think for themselves. So we ask you, especially those of you who have watched Africa from afar with hope or heartbreak, do you believe that Africa must continue following borrowed models, or has the time come for African-led systems, democratic but different, to finally take shape? Your answer matters. If you believe that democracy must serve the people, not the headlines, please share this video. If you believe that President Ibrahim Traore's reforms and Odinga's questions deserve the world's attention, please subscribe. And if you're one of the few who saw this moment coming, welcome. You're not alone anymore.